The French Revolution, Part 2. On August 27, 1789, the Third Estate, now calling itself a National Assembly, issued a constitution for France entitled the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It would be continually refined through 1791 and was heavily influenced by the Enlightenment, the Declaration of Independence, and the U.S. Constitution. The Declaration of the Rights of Man guaranteed to all French citizens civil liberties. These are basic human rights, basic human freedoms, including the freedom of speech, press, religion, and the right to assemble. This Constitution also provided legal equality to the citizens of France. This was an idea popularized by the French philosophe Voltaire, who believed that punishment should fit the crime, not the criminal. In keeping with that idea, legal equality was guaranteed by the Declaration of the Rights of Man. In other words, the punishment would fit the crime, not the criminal's social status, level of educational attainment, or religious affiliation. The Declaration of the Rights of Man also guaranteed equal rights for all men in France, not for women. The Constitution also provided for equal opportunity. This, of course, was a common complaint. The lack of equal opportunity was a common complaint before the start of the French Revolution. It was tradition in France that if a person was born into the Third Estate, that is the lowest estate or lowest class of people in the nation, he would die there. Laws prohibited French citizens in the Third Estate from moving up in society and bettering themselves and the lives of their families. The Declaration of the Rights of Man provided that all men in France had equal opportunity guaranteed by law. If a man was satisfied with being poor, so be it. But if he desired more opportunity, desired to move up in society, to attain a better job, more education, laws would no longer stand in his way and prohibit him from doing so. This Constitution also created for France a one-house legislature. Representatives elected by the people to represent their wants, needs, and desires, to share and balance the power of the monarch of France. This, of course, meant that France became a constitutional monarchy. The Constitution was the Declaration of the Rights of Man. The monarch was Louis XVI. In a constitutional monarchy, there is a sharing of power between a hereditary monarch, that is a king or queen who has inherited that position from family right, who shares power with the representatives of the people, usually called a parliament. So in a constitutional monarchy, there is a sharing and balance of power between a monarch and the representatives of the people. The Declaration of the Rights of Man said that in order for the monarch of France to make a declaration of war against another country, he would have to have the unanimous consent of this newly created one-house legislature. This, of course, was aimed at the memory of Louis XIV, who had created a huge national debt for France by keeping that country at war for 33 years, making war at his whim. Whenever Louis XIV wanted to go to war, he did, with no concern or care for how it would impact the country of France. This declaration of war provision was also aimed at the memory of Louis XV, who had gotten the country of France involved in a war with Great Britain over Canada, called the 7 Years' War, in which Canada was lost by France to Great Britain. Of course, we cannot forget that this declaration of war provision would also be aimed at Louis XVI, who had just added to the debt he received from Louis XIV and Louis XV by participating in the American Revolution as revenge for the 7 Years' War. So, in an attempt to limit the power of the king and limit the king's ability to further put the country into debt over war, The Declaration of the Rights of Man said that there had to be unanimous consent of the one-house legislature who represented the wants, needs, and interests of the people. All it would take is one person in that one-house legislature who said no, and in that case, there could be no declaration of war. Of course, unanimous consent is probably not a good idea, and we'll see this later. They probably should have said a simple majority, or 2/3 or 3/4. Gaining unanimous consent for any war effort would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. The Declaration of the Rights of Man also created a kind of paper money called assignats. You might remember from our previous lecture, the people of France did not believe in using soft money or paper money because they thought, rightly so, that it was worthless and not valuable. The French people only liked hard money, that is to say gold and silver coins, which were valuable because they were made of gold and silver. Well, to deal with the problem of money shortage in the country of France, the National Assembly created soft money or paper money called assignats that they knew the people of France would use if the assignat or soft paper money had something to give it value, since the paper that it was printed on was worthless. So the clergy was abolished as an estate. In fact, all estates were abolished with this Declaration of the Rights of Man. There was no longer a first, second, or third estate. But the clergy was dealt with most harshly. They were abolished as an estate. Their land was confiscated and used as backing for the assignat. So the people of France were willing to use this newly created soft paper money called assignat because for every piece of paper money there was acreage confiscated from the clergy, which gave that money value. The clergy were also made state employees and expected to swear an oath of loyalty to France's new constitutional form of government. The Declaration of the Rights of Man also published a couple of acts which converted France to the use of the metric system and abolished feudalism and serfdom. Even though feudalism and serfdom as a way of life had been on the way out since the Black Death of the 1350s in France, it was made official here with the acts published along with the Declaration of the Rights of Man. That meant that no longer were there peasants or agricultural slaves being used in France. So, the Declaration of the Rights of Man has created for France a constitutional monarchy. The National Assembly, or Third Estate, who wrote this Constitution, felt that France was a bit too unstable at the time for elections to be held to choose representatives to serve in that newly created one-house legislature. So they started to think carefully. Well, this is just August of 1789, and they were elected in May of 1789 to represent the people at the Palace of Versailles to meet with Louis XVI to talk about tax reform. So they figure, well, we were elected 3 months ago by the people. It would probably be okay if we served as this one-house legislature to continue to represent the needs and desires of the French people and to share and balance Louis XVI's power. So until France became stable and secure and free elections could be held, the National Assembly served as the first one-house legislature in France's constitutional monarchy. So from August of 1789 until September of 1791, France was a constitutional monarchy. The Constitution is the Declaration of the Rights of Man. The monarch is Louis XVI. The one-house legislature, which represents the people and keeps Louis XVI's power in check, is the National Assembly. In September of 1791, the National Assembly felt that France was stable and secure. They stepped down. Elections were held for men to replace them as the representatives of the people in the one-house legislature in France's new constitutional monarchy. So in October of 1791, the National Assembly is replaced with the Legislative Assembly. The Legislative Assembly was really destined to fail from its beginning, and that is because it was dominated by two different kinds of groups, two groups with very different, polar opposite political views, who could never see eye to eye on any issue. One group is known by many different names. This one group is called variously the Jacobin faction, the Montagnard, the Mountain, liberals, radicals, leftist, left-wing, radicals. The other group were called the Girondin faction, or Girondists, or right-wing, or the right. So these two groups were very different in their backgrounds and political beliefs and desires for France's future. The Jacobin faction was usually made up of younger politicians who were somewhat inexperienced politically, but all shared the belief that monarchy of any kind was outdated, that it was an old-fashioned, antiquated kind of idea, and their goal for France, whenever the time was right, they planned to seize the opportunity to get rid of Louis XVI, to make France something they thought was more modern, like a republic in which there would be only popularly elected representatives of the people. The Girondin faction, on the other hand, were older, more experienced politicians who, unlike the Jacobin faction, were very level-headed and had a tendency to want to think about every possible repercussion or result of their actions. The Jacobin faction, on the other hand, had a tendency to be very impulsive, to make decisions just on the spur of a moment without thinking about all the possible results from that action. So these two groups did not see eye to eye because the Girondin faction were very slow, methodical kinds of people, whereas the Jacobin faction had a tendency to be very emotional. The Girondin faction liked the idea of constitutional monarchy. The Jacobin faction, as I said a moment ago, wanted to move France away from monarchy altogether. Imagine inside the Legislative Assembly a stadium seating sort of scenario. Inside the Legislative Assembly there was a small center circular area or platform on which members of these various factions would stand to address the whole of the Legislative Assembly. And sitting all around them in a circular fashion would be the other members of the Legislative Assembly. They sat in stadium seats. So it makes good sense that the Jacobin faction, who shared the same basic backgrounds and views about France, had a tendency to sit together. The Girondin faction congregated together and sat together also, and there were some people who really did not fit in with the Jacobin faction or with the Girondin faction. They were sometimes very liberal, very radical, and agreed with the Jacobin faction on some issues, and at other times they were very conservative and agreed with the Girondin faction on other issues. So they didn't really fit in. Those people who didn't fit in easily and cleanly into either category sat together. So when you would look out at the Legislative Assembly, what you would see is that the Jacobin faction all sat on the left. The Girondin faction all sat on the right. The people who were sometimes liberal, sometimes conservative, sat in the center. Now let me just add a little something extra here. The Jacobin faction, who sat on the left, often sat in the highest seats, on the highest level of the stadium seating, and that is why they're called the Montagnard faction also. Montagnard is a French word that means mountain. So as I said a moment ago, the Jacobin faction is called the Montagnard, the mountain, liberal, radical, left, leftist, or left wing. Now we understand why leftist, left, or left wing, they're sitting on the left. Why called the Montagnard or mountain? Because they're sitting in the highest seats. The Girondin faction, again on the right, the people who don't fit into either category, in the center. Now this may be ringing a bell for some of you. You may have heard in American politics today the terms left, left wing, right, right wing, or center used to describe various politicians in the American political system. So what do these terms left, right, and center mean? And where did they originate? Well, the terms left, right, and center originated inside the Legislative Assembly of the French Revolution. Left means politically liberal or radical. Right means conservative. Center means moderate. On some issues liberal, on others conservative, but not clearly one or the other. So those terms left, right, and center to describe people of various political ideas and political leanings developed with the seating arrangement inside the Legislative Assembly. Well, as I said a moment ago, the ultimate goal of the Jacobin, Montagnard, mountain, liberal, radical, leftist, left-wing, left faction of the Legislative Assembly was to move France towards a republic. They were going to do this first chance they got. Well, an opportunity presented itself late in 1791. In 1791, many countries around Europe who were still absolutist countries were looking at the French Revolution with a great deal of trepidation. They were nervous, feeling insecure. The point of the French Revolution is to rid France of absolutism. Absolutist countries that neighbored France, particularly Austria and Prussia, began to regard the French Revolution as a cancer. In fact, they described it as a revolutionary cancer that must be stopped before it spread outside of France. So Austria and Prussia put together an ultimatum which they sent to the Legislative Assembly. It was called the Declaration of Pillnitz. In 1791, Austria and Prussia, absolutist states, neighbors of France, who feared the revolution would spread to their countries and undermine their absolutist regimes, sent to the Legislative Assembly and Louis XVI an ultimatum called the Declaration of Pillnitz, and in it they said, the French Revolution must stop. We want assurances that this revolution is over now that you have a legislative assembly in place, that you have a constitutional monarchy. It's going to stop. It's not going to continue to the point that you get rid of a monarch altogether. We want assurances that you are going to keep a monarch and that you have no desire to get involved in other countries to bring about the end of absolutism in these other places. So what Austria and Prussia expected from Louis XVI and the Legislative Assembly was an assurance that they were going to keep in France a monarch of some type, even if it was a constitutional monarch, which Austria and Prussia aren't real crazy about. They wanted Louis XVI to have a return to absolutist power, but they would settle for France keeping a monarch, and as long as they didn't try to push the revolution to other countries, Austria and Prussia would be okay. So what the Legislative Assembly does when they get this makes sense if you've paid close attention to what I've said about these two different groups. The Girondin faction wanted to really just mull over, think about for a long time the Declaration of Pillnitz and the best way to respond to it so that they did not create more problems for France. The Jacobin faction wanted to respond immediately by telling Austria and Prussia what was going on in France was none of their business. So, the Jacobin faction responded to the Declaration of Pillnitz more or less by telling Austria and Prussia that if they thought they needed to invade France, to go ahead and try it. You can see that this is a great deal of immaturity being expressed in that reply to the Declaration of Pillnitz. So Austria and Prussia did, in fact, choose to invade France as a result. Now, we would expect with Austria and Prussia invading France over the response they received to the Declaration of Pillnitz that France would immediately declare war on Austria and Prussia. But there's a problem. In order for Louis XVI to declare war on Austria and Prussia, who were in the process of invading and overrunning his country, he has to have unanimous consent by all of the members of the Legislative Assembly. Some refused. Some of the Centre and Girondin faction did not wish to declare war. So the war effort got bogged down, and France was almost overrun by Austria and Prussia before they could make a response to the invasion. So the Jacobin faction seized the opportunity. They point out, see, this constitutional monarchy stuff just does not work. It doesn't work in times of need like this. What they pointed out was that 1792 marked a new phase of the French Revolution. To that point, from 1789 to 1792, the French Revolution had been a civil war between various groups in France over France's future politically. Well, the French Revolution is still going to be a civil war from 1792 until 1799, but it now has a new added dimension. Now, France is fighting an international phase of the French Revolution. From 1792 to 1799, the French are going to be fighting each other over France's future political development. How will it evolve? Will France have a constitutional monarchy, a return to absolutism? Will we have a republic? What's it going to be? But now they're also going to have to fight Austria and Prussia, who want to see an end to the revolution in France altogether. And then later on, Great Britain and Spain get involved on the side of Austria and Prussia. So from 1792 to 1799, the French Revolution is both a civil war and an international war. The Jacobin faction points out that having to have a unanimous consent on every issue during a period of war is just going to slow the thing down. So they seized the opportunity to take over. They were slightly larger than the Girondin or Centre factions. They seized the opportunity to take over the Legislative Assembly and change its name. The Legislative Assembly was done away with in 1792 when the international phase of the French Revolution began. In place of the Legislative Assembly, we now have a National Convention, as it's called. The National Convention is still influenced by two groups, Jacobin, Mountain or Montagnard, and the Girondin or Girondist faction. So we still have left, right, and center groups in the National Convention. It's just that at this point, the Jacobin faction is biggest, most powerful, and most influential. Using their bigger numbers, they proclaimed France a republic in 1792 and abolished the monarchy. They said there was no room in France for a monarch, period. That means they don't need Louis XVI. So one of the first actions of the National Convention in early 1793 is to send Louis XVI to the guillotine where he was beheaded. So France is now a republic. Leading the Jacobin faction are radical young men named Robespierre, Marat, and Danton. Of these three, the one that was most feared by your average, everyday, common person in France was Jean-Paul Marat. He was a newspaper editor who at various times had suggested that he should be a dictator in France. And of course, that's highly offensive to many French people who were against absolutism. Dictatorship is a form of absolutism. If they don't want an absolutist king, they certainly don't want a dictator. So a young woman from the French countryside named Charlotte Corday murdered or assassinated Marat. So he was done away with, leaving behind Robespierre and Danton as the leaders of the Jacobin faction. Robespierre, it turns out, was actually much more dangerous than Marat had been. Robespierre was a lawyer by profession and a member of the bourgeoisie. Robespierre was definitely obsessed with power, and he used the opportunity to more or less take the French Revolution in a more and more radical and then absolutely violent direction. So the first real evidence we see of Robespierre moving the revolution in a more violent direction is the beheading of Louis XVI early in 1793, and then Robespierre's alliance of the Jacobin faction with a group of radical workers called the sans-culottes in France. Sans-culottes means men who wear long pants. The thing to understand here is that culottes were short pants. Sans is a French word that means without, so it means without short pants or without culottes. Culottes or short pants were worn by aristocrats. Sans-culottes, then, men who wear long pants, are poor men. They are the earliest factory workers in France, and they had a tendency to be very violent and very radical. The sans-culottes were known to destroy machines on their work sites, to urinate into machinery because they were dissatisfied with their jobs, the conditions, and their lack of bathroom breaks, and they were just a very violent group of young men working in France's early factories. So when Robespierre allied the Jacobin faction with the sans-culottes, many people in France feared that the revolution was about to get out of hand, and some actually fled the country and went to neighboring Austria and Prussia seeking safe haven. So Robespierre, after allying with the sans-culottes, creates an organization called the Committee of Public Safety, which he appoints as a security force. And what he said its official purpose was to maintain security in France. I mean, let's face it, things in France are really out of control. We've got France fighting Austria and Prussia, the French people fighting each other over whether or not the country should be a republic, whether or not Louis XVI should have been beheaded or not. France is a mess. So he appoints a Committee of Public Safety, a security force, a police force to try to maintain order. The real objective of the Committee of Public Safety is to hunt down anyone who is considered to be an enemy to Robespierre and Danton, anybody who's an enemy of the Jacobin faction. In other words, their job is to round up anyone who is too conservative, anyone who might be speaking out against Robespierre and the proclamation of France as a republic. That means their main target are members of the Girondin faction. This begins a period in the French Revolution from the summer of 1793 until the summer of 1794, known as the Reign of Terror. And this actually happens to be the focus of one of the most famous novels in literature. Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, which some of you may have read, is set against the Reign of Terror. During this year-long period called the Reign of Terror, death carts were extremely frequent along Paris streets. Death carts were more or less wagons that were used by the Committee of Public Safety to transport political prisoners from jail to the guillotine. And it's estimated in that 1 year period from the summer of 1793 until the summer of 1794, Robespierre and Danton used the Committee of Public Safety to round up Girondins. Their only crime is that they challenged Robespierre and Danton. They challenged whether or not France should be a republic. And when we consider that their only crime is that they spoke out against Robespierre, it's really quite disturbing to hear that in that 1 year, 40,000 people were executed at the guillotine. Their only crime? Speaking out against Robespierre. So the death carts were very, very prominent in that year, taking people from prison to their death at the guillotine. Robespierre pushed things even farther. It's bad enough that he kills 40,000 people at the guillotine for questioning him, but he also does some more radical things in France too. He starts rationing bread to the poor people. This was more or less an attempt by Robespierre, and it did work, to win the support of the poor people. The poor people, as you can imagine, and I'm talking about the really poor people, the people who were homeless, who were living on the streets of Paris, they weren't really concerned about absolutism and constitutionalism, republic versus monarchy. They weren't concerned about that kind of stuff. They were worried about eating and surviving. So by giving these people bread, rationing them bread, giving them bread, Robespierre bought their support. He also began to fix wages and prices of goods. Inflation is often a problem in war. More money in circulation, but it buys less. So he attempted to rectify that situation by fixing wages and prices so that the wages that a person was paid would still be able to buy commodities that were necessary for living. Sometimes during a period of war, what you see happen is that the prices of various goods and services rise while wages remain fixed or decline, and that of course means you can buy less. So Robespierre attempted to fix wages or salaries and prices of goods and services so that people could still function during this period of war in France and in the international phase of the French Revolution. His most popular actions, though, which lead to his downfall, is that Robespierre starts a new calendar for France based on the metric system, and this is just really strange. But Robespierre felt that the proclamation of the Republic in France was the most significant event to have happened in Western history since the birth of Jesus Christ. Therefore, he said, the calendar should start all over again. So in France, year 1 was 1792. Year 2, 1793, so on and so forth. So he started the calendar all over again in France. And Robespierre was kind of surprised that the rest of Europe didn't follow suit. Only this was used in France, year 1, 1792. He also wanted to make the calendar more metric, which does not work. He figured that instead of 24-hour days, you could have 20-hour days, 10 hours of daytime, 10 hours of nighttime, 5-day weeks. Well, this is a complete and total mess, and by the end of the first year, the calendar was all out of whack. Holidays that were supposed to be coming in the fall were coming in the spring, and then you have all these extra days that don't fit into months, and what do you do with them? And, well, what Robespierre said is, they're complimentary days. The calendar was a complete and total mess. Nobody knew in France when it really was. What month is this? What day is this? We have no idea. It was very unpopular. But Robespierre's most unpopular act was when he de-Christianized France. He said Christianity, whether Protestant or Roman Catholic, was no longer allowed in the country of France. It could not be Christian. As he pointed out, since the Protestant Reformation, France had been a mess with Protestants and Catholics fighting each other, killing each other over who was the rightful church, etc., etc. He said, okay, my answer to that is there's no more Christianity. Instead, he came up with a new god for France to worship, and her name was the Supreme Being. And if you look for images of the Supreme Being proclaimed by Robespierre, you will notice that she looks a whole lot like our Statue of Liberty. So he says, here's a new god. Her name is the Supreme Being, and we will all agree to worship her. Well, this did not go over well, and many people inside France thought that Robespierre had gone too far. He needed to be eliminated. This led to what's called the Thermidorian reaction in 1794. The French month July was changed by Robespierre to Thermidor, meaning hot month. So the Thermidorian reaction occurred in July 1794, or, as Robespierre was calling it, Thermidor in year 3. So in what was known as Thermidor, year 3, or July 1794 for everybody else, the bourgeoisie, many of them having been friends of Robespierre, turned against him. They reacted to the growing violence of 40,000 people being put to death in the space of a year, of the de-Christianization of France, of rationing and fixing wages and prices. They responded to the growing radical nature of the French Revolution and turned against the Jacobin or Mountain faction. The liberals and radicals that were dominating France were all rounded up, including Robespierre, and put in prison. They were then executed, I think somewhat fittingly, at the guillotine. It only makes sense that since they were responsible for putting to death 40,000 people at the guillotine, they should end up there themselves. So the bourgeoisie turned against Robespierre, the Jacobin or Mountain faction, put them in jail, and then started taking them by death carts to the guillotine. So the National Convention was dismissed by the bourgeoisie, Robespierre was guillotined, and in place of the National Convention, a new government was proclaimed for France. It was a two-house legislature. A new constitution was written. It was based on the Declaration of the Rights of Man, but changed a little bit. And 5 men were established as directors. So from 1795 until 1799, France was under the control of the Directory, or 5 directors. These 5 men ruled France and balanced out their power somewhat with representatives of the people in a two-house legislature from 1795 until 1799. But here we go again. For some reason, there's just something about getting a little taste of power that becomes so seductive to some people that it goes to their head and it becomes an obsession. The same thing happened to the directors that had happened to Robespierre. The directors, who started out with the best of intentions, by 1799 had become obsessed with their own power. They too started hunting down people who questioned them, putting their enemies in jail, and growing very oppressive. And the French people began to turn against this latest revolutionary government called the Directory. Some in France were begging and pleading, can't we find a single man in the whole country of France to rescue us from these problems? Is there no one to turn to? And yet there was someone. There was a popular military hero in France at this point, a young, dashing military officer by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. And it just so happened that Napoleon's brother served in the two-house legislature that was currently ruling France along with those directors. He told Napoleon who was out fighting during the international phase of the French Revolution, leading troops against France's enemies, Austria, Prussia, Spain, and Great Britain. He told Napoleon, "There's a desire in this country for the return of a strong man, and people love and admire you. Why don't you stage what the French call a coup d'etat, or an overthrow of the government, and be our new ruler? You would certainly enjoy popular support for this." So, in November of 1799, the government changes for the last time during this period known as the French Revolution. In November of 1799, with wide popular support, Napoleon Bonaparte overthrows the Directory and establishes himself as the first consul of France.